welcome to another installment of Uniquely Union. And I have the pleasure of interviewing a very interesting person today, Park Ranger Derek Wilson. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm so sorry to you all out there you didn't get to hear the conversation we had before this recording's made, but maybe we'll get you some snippets of it back in. But very interesting stuff. Tell me your background, where you were born, raised, and how you came to be in the Park Service and how you wound up at Big Ridge.
Okay. Well, I was originally born at UT Hospital, lived in Fountain City of Knoxville, and lived there until I really started grade school. We've moved out to Blount County, and then lived out in Blount County until I started college, and then I moved out to Middle Tennessee and went to college at Tennessee Tech University. Studied wildlife and fisheries with concentration in fisheries. And then when I graduated college, just started looking into jobs where I could be outdoors and maybe apply that education. And Tennessee State Parks was the first ones that gave me that opportunity. And so I'm very appreciative of that. And it's been a good job.
That's great. How long have you been with
I've been with them
Service?
full-time for 10 years, and I did 2 years of summer seasonal work before that. Mm-hmm. I started off, my first job with them was as a seasonal at Fall Creek Falls State Park. Beautiful park. Almost spoiled me. It's hard to beat that once you start off your first job as a seasonal, and they let you do all the fun stuff, and then reality sets in, you start working the real work and the real dirty work. But no, honestly, it's been a great job. And then my second summer, I went to Henry Horton State Park. It's not maybe as a glorified park as Fall Creek Falls, but it still has its own beauty. That goes for anywhere in Tennessee, in my opinion. And I liked Henry Horton. It was a great place to get some good experience before I became a ranger, especially because the rangers there were good to help me, and they knew that I wanted to become a park ranger. Mm-hmm. So they helped to let me get this experience I needed by letting me ride along with them and so forth. And I still use a lot of the things that I saw them do and adapted to my own style of managing the park and managing the public, because that's a big part of the park work. Is as much as I would love to manage wildlife and manage the land itself, a lot of it's really managing people. Mm-hmm. But I've learned to really appreciate that as well. So it's a blessing to be able to have the interactions with people and have the influence, especially with younger people coming up. With you being in education, I'm sure you know what I mean about that. It's such an honor to be able to be an influence to the next generation of how they feel about parks or how they feel about our natural resources and so forth. So
And how long have you been at Big Ridge?
10 years. So when I got hired on full time, I was sent to Big Ridge. And up until that point, I didn't even know Big Ridge existed. I grew up in East Tennessee and didn't know that was such a great jewel sitting right out here. And I don't know why we never camped at Big Ridge. My dad took us camping. We did go to Cove Lake several times. My dad was living in Middle Tennessee at the time, so we did a lot of camping on Center Hill Lake and Dale Hollow Lake. But we never went to Big Ridge, which is surprising because we love being on the lake, and that campground's perfect for being right there on the water. We were boaters, but we just never went out there. And when I actually was doing just a little stint at Norris Dam State Park. Mm-hmm. It was kind of off season. They stuck me out there to do a little trail work, and the park manager at the time, I asked him. I said, "Look, I don't care where I work. I really just don't want to get laid off. I'm out of college. I was out of college at the time," and I said, "I don't care. Just put me cleaning bathrooms, mowing, whatever maintenance needs you need. I'd like to become a ranger, but until then, I'll do whatever I can just to keep a job and keep my foot in the door." And he said, "Well, I don't have any openings." He said, "But John Howe out at Big Ridge is going to have an opening." He said, "You got to go talk to him." I said, "Okay." Of course, by that time, I had kind of knew about Big Ridge and had not been out there yet. So I drove out there, and I was like, "Wow, this is a beautiful place." Mm-hmm. Never imagined that was going to be where I would be, well, now for a decade. Mm-hmm. And so with me not knowing anything about it too, and not thinking I had any ties to Union County. Once I got the job out there, out here at Big Ridge, that's when I started realizing that I had a lot more ties to Union County than I ever thought I would or knew about.
Small world, isn't it?
It is a small world, and I got to talk to my dad, and come to find out, the Wilsons we were related to, they were from what is now Chuck Swan, and then he was raised on the other side of the lake in Speedwell. But his dad was from Union County. His granddad was from the Sharps Chapel area, or like I say, what's now known as Chuck Swan. So I never would have thought that I would have had ties to this area. And then on top of that, when I got hired on with State Parks, I had told them I'll work anywhere in the state of Tennessee. I love East Tennessee. I really like Middle Tennessee, but I'll work anywhere. And so that was kind of a hint. I'll go to West Tennessee. I don't want to go, but I'll go to West Tennessee if I have to. I'm not much of a flatlander person, but to get my foot in the door, I'd have worked at any park. And they sent me to Big Ridge, and it was a blessing, and it was a godsend because I'm now 45 minutes from my dad and 45 minutes from my mom. And now I'm having kids of my own, and so it's great to be close to my parents and my family.
Union County has definitely 3 treasures. Of course, Norris Lake's one of them. I'd say a lot of people know about Norris Lake. Chuck Swan may not be as well known, but it's pretty much a treasure too. Then there's Big Ridge.
Yes, sir.
And you are very fortunate to be affiliated with one of the 3 great treasures of the county.
I agree.
And the state, for that matter.
I agree.
What is your exact official job title?
If you was to give it the exact title that I'm given, it's Ranger 2 with Tennessee State Parks, stationed at Big Ridge State Park. Ranger 1 is kind of an entry level. I guess when you're on your probationary period, you're Ranger 1, and then after you get out of that probationary period, you get you get placed into the Ranger 2 position. And then there, I believe, is a Ranger 3 position, maybe now, and then there is a Ranger 3 position, and then there are levels of park managers too. Our park only has a park manager 2 position, I believe it is, and then we have 3 park ranger 2 positions. Depending on how many park ranger positions and how many park manager positions you have, a lot depends on the size of the park, how many facilities you have. So, for example, something maybe like Fall Creek Falls, they usually will have a park manager 3, and then maybe a park manager 1 as an assistant park manager. But our park at Big Ridge, not having as many facilities, we don't have a hotel, we don't have a restaurant, and so without having some of those resort type facilities, we just have a park manager 2 position, and then 3 rangers. And some parks may have more or less. Some parks are so small, they only have a park manager and a park ranger, and may not even have maintenance staff. So the park rangers are actually mowing and picking up the garbage, so forth.
So who is the park manager at Big Ridge?
Currently, it's Keith Montgomery. He was raised in West Knoxville. Just recently, I guess he's lived in West Knoxville his whole life, as far as I know. Actually, I take that back. He was born, I think, in Georgia, but that was so brief that he mostly was raised and has lived in West Knoxville his whole life until recently. He just moved up to Cherry Bottom, up just above Lake City, between Lake City and Caryville. I think it's a Caryville address. But yeah, he's our park manager, Keith Montgomery.
So were you to climb to the very tip top of your profession, what would your title be then, and where might you be located?
I'd be the governor of the state of Tennessee.
We know where you'd be located then, don't we?
Right, in Nashville, Tennessee. Well, if it was just within parks, I guess it would be director of parks, or maybe even we have a position that the title kind of changes every now and then, but it's I'm trying to think what they even call it right now. It's a commissioner, commissioner of parks. We have a commissioner of parks and a deputy commissioner. A lot of times, the commissioner, I say of parks, it's really a TDEC, which stands for Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. And a lot of times the commissioner of TDEC usually deals a little bit more of the environmental side. They're the ones that permit things anything that would relate to the environment. When a factory maybe uses, say, a stream to cool the water of something they're building or something they're doing, they would have to get a permit through the state. And that goes through TDEC offices. But then we fall under that same department, and they consider us more of the conservation side of things. And a lot of times our deputy commissioner will be a little bit more specified with parks. But we have a director of parks, and right now that's Mike Robertson. I actually give him a lot of credit for me getting hired into state parks. Because I got to know Mike, and Mike Robertson had a big influence, I'm sure, into me being an employee with the state of Tennessee. So I have to give him some credit there. But yeah, I'd say he's the top dog in parks.
Have any aspirations to climb yourself? Are you pretty satisfied? Or?
I'm really satisfied where I'm at right now. A lot of that too is because I've got kids, and with my family being so close. Those jobs are demanding, and a lot of times I would probably have to do those within Nashville, or at least spend a lot of time in Nashville. And so I would rather, I think, be where I'm at. Although I have tried for some other parks to be a park manager and so forth, but God knows what's best for me more than I do myself a lot of times. And so it's worked out for the best so far that I have been just a Big Ridge as a ranger, and I have no problem with that. And if I finish my career as just a park ranger at Big Ridge, I will be completely happy with that.
That's great.
But now one of these days when my kids are grown and so forth, if they want me to be a director of parks, I'd probably do it if they thought I was the person for the job.
Okay. Now, as a condition of being a park ranger at Big Ridge, do you have to live in Union County? Is that one of their requirements?
Well, I don't believe I would have to live in Union County per se, but they do want you as close as possible to respond to incidents that might go on in the park. They used to provide housing for us, and they still do, but they went to charging us rent for the parks. And that wasn't horrible because they gave us a really good raise to compensate for that. And it actually encouraged a lot of rangers to maybe find places off the park. And so in that way they're not in such a pickle when they retire, because they either have equity in a place, or even have a place of their own when they do retire, instead of being let go from parks and retiring and thinking, now I'm going to have to find a place to live and be able to take on a mortgage now as a retired person. And so it's actually been a good thing. And they have also released some of that mandatory living on the park. So they don't make you live on the park. And it actually worked out the best for me too, because I would have never moved off the park if they'd let me live there for free. But now that now they charge me rent, encouraged me to move off the park, and I'm so glad I did. I've now owned myself a little piece of Union County myself, and quite proud of that. And
Great.
I'm glad I did. I've been encouraged to do so.
Now, how many rangers does Big Ridge have total?
We have 3, including myself. So currently it's me, and then there's Grant Sherrod and Hannah Pascal. And both of them have worked at other parks before. Hannah actually went through police academy with me 10 years ago. And so she's worked at several parks, but has landed at Big Ridge. And she's originally from, I think she grew up around Bristol area there, and she's moved around a lot too, so she lived for some time out in West Tennessee. Grant actually is from the Powell area, so he's also from around these parts. And he recently transferred, and I say recently, a couple of years ago, he transferred to Big Ridge. And I think he had worked at Harrison Bay before which is near Chattanooga, before he was able to transfer up here to Big Ridge. And both of them seem happy there.
That's great. We like happy people in Union County.
Sure.
You alluded to the police academy.
Yes, sir.
Is that a requirement you had to do to pursue the park ranger?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
They provide all that training for you through the state of Tennessee. So you do have to have a college education before you are considered as a ranger. Once you have that education, then you are eligible for the job. Then if you get hired on, then they will send you through police academy. And so it is definitely a necessity for the job. They require it. And I can see why. These parks are beautiful places, and sometimes they're quite a ways away from any kind of law enforcement presence, at least regular law enforcement presence.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of us are actually EMTs as well, which is also beneficial, having been able to deal with medical emergencies as well as law enforcement emergencies. It really helps the visitors of the park to keep it safer and so forth. But yes, they do. They train us, and they continue to train us, keep us updated with our training.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So you've been at Big Ridge 1 decade, 10 years.
That's right.
How have things changed during that decade, or have they, in your estimation, or have they remained pretty much status quo?
Yeah, well, they have changed.
From the park perspective.
Yes, they have changed a lot. I say a lot. It's only been 10 years, and 10 years is not that long, but it does seem like a lot has changed in 10 years. And I am very interested in the park's history, so I know what kind of changes the park has went through since its creation. But there has been a lot of changes. Some just right off the top of my head, since I've been there, one of the biggest changes was the reservation system, with internet being so much more widespread in everybody's homes, with it being either at their handheld with their cell phones and so forth. Mm-hmm. We went from a first come first served basis to now having a reservation system, and that was statewide. Actually, I even remember myself growing up that we camped in a lot of state parks, and I remember my father pulling a camper middle of the week sometimes and dropping it off at a park and paying for several nights before we got there, so that we'd have that site for the weekend. And sometimes we would camp at other places like Corps of Engineer campgrounds, because they did have reservation systems in place. So that's been one of the biggest changes, is having a reservation system.
I think that's very beneficial.
I do too.
Because I would hate to drive maybe 100 or more miles to go to a state park and then get there and it's full.
Yes.
Sorry, what do you do now?
That's right. It does, and it does provide an opportunity for people that maybe not from around here, that might drive from far off, and that's a good thing too. It's a hidden jewel, and I do believe that the existence of parks is really a lot for the local people, and they definitely have a little hidden gem here. But there's nothing wrong, I think, with sharing that sometimes too with the rest of the world. And I say world because there's people that come from Canada and all over the other places in the country, as well as other countries, to Big Ridge. Not real common, but they do from time to time. And it's a beautiful place. It's a very visited place because of the internet now. That's another big change I've seen. When I first started working the park, it was more local people. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with that, but I do see a lot more people from out of the area that's coming to see Big Ridge now. And a lot of that, I think, is because of the internet, the advertisement, and so forth. So the visitation has definitely increased in my time at Big Ridge. And I've been told recently we were one of the most visited state parks in the system. I don't know where we stand, but I'd heard a statistic once that we're maybe the second, third, no more than maybe the fourth most visited state park in the system.
That's pretty impressive.
That is a pretty impressive something to note about Big Ridge, because there's some beautiful parks and very near a lot more attention, whether it be bigger cities or places like Fall Creek Falls, which they are the most visited state park. But just because of their reputation, they do get a lot of visitors. But for us to kind of approach that number that they have, that's something to be noted.
And that brings to mind, there are state parks, then there are national parks, and then there are wildlife preserves or reserves.
Yes, sir.
Briefly, what's the difference? I mean, I kind of know, but
Yes, sir.
deep down, what's the real difference?
A lot of the differences are the way the land is used. So a lot of the national parks and state parks have a very similar land use. They're just like in their title. One is owned by the federal government or operated through the federal government, and one is owned or operated through the state of Tennessee. But then when you've got state forests, just like you have federal forest lands. Those lands a lot of times will have more allowable hunting. They may have, like Chuck Swan, where they allow some logging. The state will actually make some revenues from the resources by logging it. And they also use places like forest, which I consider a WMA, which stands for Wildlife Management Area, which is usually controlled or taken care of by the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency. And that they'll put a little bit more principles and techniques of habitat management into those, so that you're managing for the wildlife for hunters to come out and be able to harvest game, whether it be ducks, dove, deer, turkey, or anything and so forth like that. In state parks, they don't usually do as much habitat management. We're looking to just be a little bit more natural. So we don't manage the habitat as much. We just let it be natural, and so that people can come out and see what the state of Tennessee looks like in its natural state. Some parks do allow some hunting. Big Ridge does not, but there are parks that have some hunting zones because the land is so large. But generally, parks are just about conservation. And then we have even a little bit more conservation-minded land use that falls under TDEC, also called, they call it natural areas. And so natural areas are even more of that conservation mindset. So they usually won't have campgrounds. Usually about the only thing you'll have in these natural areas are trails. And that still kind of goes to that conservation, because if you keep people on the trails, you're having less impact on the land, because people are going to go out there anyways. It's their land, it's public property. They're going to hike on it, so you might as well put some trails out there so that they can appreciate it, but also not damage maybe any ecosystems that are out there. But parks are a little bit in between there. You know, we're doing conservation, but it's a little bit more recreation along with that conservation. So like Big Ridge, where we've got a swimming area and we've got a campground, and some parks go as far as having hotels and restaurants. But that's the biggest difference, is the land use.
Okay. Since you have been to the police academy, do you have the ability to arrest people?
Yes, sir. I try to avoid it at all costs. But sometimes people leave you no choice.
Understood.
And that's really kind of the mindset that most administrations I've worked under, which I haven't worked under a whole lot in the 10 years I've been a park ranger, but most of them aren't looking for us to just be out there trying to drag people to jail constantly. If we can get compliance, that's the best thing we can ask for. And education. Education is one of the best tools for conservation in the parks, or I think conservation in general. Is through education. If you can teach younger generations to appreciate nature and to understand the ethics and the right things to do for conservation, that's the best thing you can teach a person. For example, wildlife in general. You see a lot of kids, even I was guilty of it when I was a kid. I'd see a baby bird's nest, and the first thing I want to do is go grab the little baby bird and say, "Oh, look, Mom, what I found, there wasn't no mama around, so I guess we need to take care of this baby bird." My mom would be like, "You put that thing back in its nest," you know. And people do that a lot still. Even deer, they'll say, "Oh, this baby deer, its mother is just abandoning it." And I'm like, no, it's not abandoning it. It's nearby. It's feeding. The best thing you can do is leave it be. But a lot of people don't know that, and there's nothing wrong with not knowing that. Like I said, I grew up not knowing a lot of those things, and some of them I didn't even know until I became a park ranger, because I'm still learning sometimes about nature myself. And so the best thing you can do sometimes for conservation is through education. But law enforcement, sometimes you just can't educate a person. Sometimes they're reluctant to learn what is right or wrong. And I mean, sometimes you have no choice. And so I have had to make a few arrests. And it's the least favorite part of my job, but I see the necessity of it. I really do see the necessity of it.
One thing a lot of people might like to know, are there a lot of bears at Big Ridge? There's been a lot of talk of bear sightings lately, it seems like, in the news.
Yeah, I've never seen a bear at Big Ridge.
Really?
Yes, sir. I've never seen a bear. I think it'd be neat. I would like to see bear. I say that now, and when they start tearing into everything, I'd be like, oh, I wish we didn't have these bears. Maybe. I don't know. But I right now, I would love to see bear there. I've heard people talk about bears, seeing bears there. I know 2 or 3 years ago, there was a couple that were coming through the area, and they must have came through the park. And some people got some pictures of them swimming out of the lake and coming up on the shore, and they swore up and down that was at Big Ridge. And it must have been, because it was a hot topic for a long time. And whether it was or wasn't, it definitely caused a stir. And there hasn't been a stir like that since. And the people around there, there's a lot of local people that know that park way better than I do. They grew up out there. They know every inch of it. And they know, I mean, so that if those bears were out there, I don't doubt them at all. I've not seen them. But on that subject, with people knowing the park, that can be beneficial too. That ties in with that whole law enforcement thing. And I appreciate the way the public has been with me, because I guess they see it as their park too, And so when they see something going on that shouldn't be there, well, with bear, that they know they should be there, but they share that with me. But when there's something that shouldn't be going on, they'll come to me. People I don't know, I've never met them before, don't know their names. They know how to get a hold of me, and they'll find out how to get a hold of me. I've had people pull up my driveway that I've never seen before. I don't know how they knew I lived there. Well, other than maybe I guess they seen that Ranger truck parked in the driveway.
Yeah, that might be a dead giveaway.
They'll come and say, "Hey, there's some people in the parking lot right now that, they're doing this or doing that." And really, I'd say half or more than half of the incidents that I've had to really take somebody to jail, and someone is really doing something that they shouldn't be in the park, the public has noticed it first and made me aware of it. And that's a good thing. I appreciate that the public wants to keep the park safe, and they appreciate the place.
It's a good sense of community pride.
Absolutely.
Is the park open year-round?
It is, yes, sir. There are some facilities we close, mostly due to lack of use, I think, is some of it, but a lot of it is because the park was built by the TBA, along with the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and they built it in the 30s, and so a lot of it is not really winter worthy. The pipes will freeze and bust and so forth. We would like to change some of that and maybe start renting some of the cabins year-round, but that's not happened yet. But the park itself is open year-round. You can come out there and hike year-round. There's a lot of things you can do year-round. You can kayak the little lake with your own personal kayak now, which is another change I've seen in my time at Big Ridge. Used to, it was only rental boats only, and now you can have a private boat as long as it's just a canoe or kayak.
And you can still do the rentals.
We do the rentals, but not in the wintertime. But there is things to do at the park, even year-round, like I say, with the hiking, whether it be bird watching, or a lot of people come out for exercise even year-round to jog the trails or jog the roads. But no, we do close the cabins. You can camp year-round too. The campground's open year-round, and we get more and more. I know I used to enjoy the winters as a little bit of time of relief. And we also do a lot of our training. The state renews a lot of our training and so forth in the wintertime. And anymore, it's hard to even get away in the wintertime to do training or this and that, because it's getting to where we've got campers year round, and it can be snow on the ground, and we'll have half a dozen to a dozen campers through the weekend or even through the week. So it is definitely increased in use.
Now, in my personal opinion, there are basically two types of camping. There's the roughing it, where maybe you have a sleeping bag or a tent and a pot to cook your beans in you brought from home, or your fish you catch or whatever.
Right.
Then there's the fancy camping, where that you bring in your big camper with all the hookups and the amenities and all that.
Yes.
Which do you see more of? I pretty much
definitely
already
see
know.
more of the fancy camping.
I figured so, yeah. Do you see a lot of the people that like to come and rough it?
From time to time. There's a term that I've heard more recently. I never heard this term as a kid myself, because we did a lot of fancy camping, as you call it.
Mm-hmm.
They got a term for that now called glamping. It's, it's glamorous camping. They call it glamping. But a lot of it is the glamping, if you want to call it that. Big RVs. Matter of fact, the park itself is kind of a camping area anyways, has evolved around that. Because when the park was first built, long before I ever worked there, it was just really a dirt path that kind of circled through there. I don't even know if they had electricity or water. May have had some spigots here and there so people get some water. Mm-hmm. I think there was a bathhouse. I'm almost certain there was a bathhouse, so you could use the restroom and wash your dishes and stuff like that. But then as camping became more of this glamorous camping, they did add electric to all the sites and pave the campground. And so, we have campsites that will easily fit 30 or 40 foot campers. We have 30 and 50 amp services to be able to provide for the campers. And there's water at every campsite. We don't have sewer at the campsites, but we have a station where they can do that on the dump on the way out. Mm-hmm. But yeah, but we do have campsites, what we call backcountry campsites, that are to appeal to the people like you're talking about, where some people really like the roughing it, put everything in a backpack and hike it out there. The only problem I've had with that a little bit is now that we went to this reservation system, it used to, we could kind of screen people before they went out and tried to stay on one of the backcountry sites. And those sites were free, but it was kind of first come, first serve, and we could say, well, do you know what you're getting yourself into when you go out there? You're going to have to hike out there. Mm-hmm. And if they show up with a cooler, you can't drag that out to those trails, But now we can't screen that as much. And so if there was a way to warn people, and I'm sure online, I don't deal with the online stuff as much. I'm sure somewhere on there, it's probably clearly stated, but they somehow overlook that from time to time. And we have had people show up and say, yeah, we're on the backcountry campsite, Dark Hollow West, and they go to, I say, you're going to try to take that cooler out there? Yeah, I don't think you know what you're getting yourself into. But a lot of people do know what they're getting themselves into, and it's a popular thing. It's gotten to be so popular where we do have to add it to the reservation system. If not, people will be camping on top of each other and so forth, because there's only a limited number of those sites.
Roughly how many sites do you have of each kind?
Right now, we've got around 50 campsites that are for the fancy camping with the big campers with the 50 and 30 amp services and water. And then we have 3 of the backcountry sites.
Three.
Now,
if I chose one of the backcountry sites, how close might I be to the other 2? Pretty separated, I would imagine.
Yes, sir. They're at least a mile from each other, probably more than 2 miles from each other, honestly.
And another question, if I chose to do this roughing it,
yes, sir.
I'm going to drive to the park.
Right.
How far from where I park to where I go to the campsite, what's the farthest outpost, so to speak?
The furthest one is probably close to 3.5, 4 miles.
No, you don't want to carry a camper that far, do you?
And the closest one is about a mile. So you got the options there, and obviously the one that's a mile away is usually rented the most. But some people really like that furthest one. I mean, they like being further away from everything else. And it's really actually a good place if you're wanting to look into that kind of camping. That style of camping, as any kind of camping, has really seemed like it's increased in popularity. I don't know why. Maybe it's the economy. Maybe because it's they call it staycation, where you stay more near home and go vacationing, where it's a little bit more affordable. Or maybe it's just getting outdoors has become more popular. I think maybe the combination of the two, as well as the internet advertising, and we've definitely got an increase in use in the park. But with that being said, I guess what I'm getting at is Big Ridge is a great place to get your feet wet with any kind of camping, because it is a great place. And there is pretty good availability, even though we are increasing in use of the park. There's definitely some availability to try out camping, either style. And for backcountry camping, it sounds rough to get out there, but it's just rough enough to where it does limit people from just dragging all kinds of junk out there. You really have to be the style of camper that is desiring that type of camping, the backpacker type. But it's not too far out to where if backpacking is something you don't know if you really want to do, but you just want to try it out, Big Ridge is a perfect place, because it's kind of hard to get lost out there. It's just close enough to where you're not going to kill yourself getting to the campsite, but you can really try it out. As opposed to the Smokies is a great place to camp and has a lot of backcountry camping options. But some of them are pretty far out there, and you might be getting yourself in over your head if you was to try to go out there and hike several miles. Because 1 or 2 miles sounds easy, but you start putting a pack on and start hiking over some of these hills and hollers of Tennessee, you realize.
Especially when you're like me, you get a pound or two on you in a few years.
I know the feeling. I hike a lot of them trails, but it takes a lot out of you.
So I'm going to rough it in Big Ridge, 3 miles out. I'm going to go as far out as I can go.
Yes, sir.
How much danger am I in to encounter a snake or some other kind of varmint? I wouldn't figure I'd encounter many dangerous people. That wouldn't be my fear, but I figure there's a few varmints out there.
I do tell people a lot of times, because they have that same question, and that's a valid question. I tell them many a times that people are the most dangerous thing you're going to come across out there. It's not dangerous overall. It's a relatively safe place. Tennessee as a whole, I feel like it's a relatively safe place. But people in general are way more dangerous than animals ever will be. Statistically speaking, there are a lot of wildlife, and if you're coming out there to see wildlife, you probably get your chance of seeing it, and that's what people want to see. You'll see deer, like we talked about earlier, more likely not a bear. Snakes, pretty likely. But what the misconception about snakes is that they are dangerous or they'll come after you, that being any wildlife. And that's just not the case. I've been out there my whole life, camping as a young boy, growing up, and then still now having a job where I'm out amongst campers. I'm out also not just out in populated areas of the park. I get out a lot in the nights, and the wildlife just don't bother you. They really want to stay away from you. I have never been bit by a snake except for the ones I've been pestering, and I deserved it. So, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. About it. Yes, that's right. I live to tell about it. Now, that's not to say it don't happen. I have had one incident in my 10 years, and it was when I first started at the park, that there was a young girl walking in flip-flops late at night and stepped on a copperhead, and it bit her. But she turned out to be fine. She healed up from it. I think she had to stay off of her foot for, maybe a couple of weeks to a month. I really don't know for certain. I just hearsay from some of the community members. But I do know she was fine afterwards. So it can happen. But if you take the right precautions, the wildlife won't bother you.
One thing, too, that occurs to me, if you were going to rough it 3 miles out, you're either going to have to collect firewood out there.
Yes, sir.
I can't imagine carrying firewood 3 miles.
Right. Well, there are most campers that do the backcountry camping nowadays. They have other alternatives to cooking with. They'll either take fuel with them, whether it be alcohol or butane or propane. bottles with them, and they have these nice little small packable things. There are also alternatives to where you do use maybe some wood fuel that's laying around, but it's very efficient, like rocket stove type things. I myself actually have one. I don't do a lot of backcountry camping per se, especially with my small children, but I do a lot of, it's maybe not as glamorous as glamping, but car camping. And they have a kettle, they call it Kelly kettle or something like this, that you can put just very little fuel in it. It'll boil water and cook over. So, but now a lot of people do like having a good old campfire when you go out there. And so you are allowed to burn stuff that's dead and already down, and there's plenty of that out there. You can take a saw and saw up. Now, because it is a state park, and like I say, a big part of what parks are is conservation. We obviously don't want people going out there and cutting trees down, especially living trees. And even dead trees provide habitat and so forth. But because we try to walk that fine balance of recreation and conservation, we allow some cutting of dead trees and dead wood for burning. So it's okay to have a campfire out there. But it does need to be maintained in the fire ring provided so that it doesn't get out and burn the forest down.
You have a lot of regular campers that come back season after season?
Oh, yes, sir.
I figured so.
Oh, yes, sir.
Yeah.
Actually, we've got a great campground host right now, and it's the first year since I've been there that we've had a campground host, and he's a great help. A lot of people know him because he's been coming around a long time. His name's David Wilkerson, and he's been coming to that park for 50 years. So he was, I guess, in his 20s, and he was already coming around that park, and or probably younger in his 20s, probably a teenager. And so, yes, we get lots of campers that come every year. We get a lot of people that say, I've never been here before. This is such a neat place. Didn't know it existed. But a lot of them, probably more than half of them for certain, are repeat customers.
That's great.
Yeah, it is.
Now let's get to some good stuff.
Okay.
Let's talk about that ghost trail.
Yes, sir.
Is it available year-round?
Yes, you can hike the Ghost Trail year-round, just like any other trails you can hike year-round. We do ask people not to be on them after dark. It's not because we're afraid the ghosts will get them or the wildlife will get them. A lot of that is conservation, like we were back talking about earlier, and because conservation not just of the land but of people. We manage the park, and the people are the park. And so we don't want people out at dark because that's when we have a lot of troubles. People get lost and so forth. And it costs a lot of resources a lot of times to go out there and actually help a person if they've been injured or they get lost. And we get that a lot of times. But if you do want to go out after dark, there are opportunities. The park has hikes that we do that are after dark that tell the history of the park, which includes some of these ghost stories, if you want to call them that.
Now, they're guided tours.
But they're guided tours, yes, sir. You're getting a ranger or at least some of the park staff that is familiar with the trails, and you're going out there with other people so that it's a little safer.
And if I took an unguided tour, do I have like a written...
No, we don't. I guess that would probably be a good idea.
Following the trail, right?
Well, there are trail markers. So you can follow the trail markers if it's something you're really interested in. Speaking for myself, I love sharing the park's history. In nature too. I enjoy educating people about the resources, and so if people are interested, they're more than welcome to come seek me out, and I will share those ghost stories with them year round. As long as I'm available and I'm not busy, trying to maintain the park. And when in my free time, I'm more than glad to talk to people about the park. But we don't really have any literature that we put out, although there has been some publications or some published literature about ghost stories, they call it, that have originated from Big Ridge. And we actually use some of that ourselves for our guided tours. Along with some that we were talking about earlier before the interview, that Renita, a former park ranger, that is now a school teacher, she did a lot of work during her time as a park ranger of collecting a lot of that stuff. And we use a lot of what she collected to kind of, I guess, lure people to these guided hikes in the fall and the evening times.
Have you personally ever seen a ghost in your 10 years there?
No, I've never seen a ghost in my life or at Big Ridge that I can recall.
I would consider that personally a good thing if I were you.
I agree. And I spend a lot of time out there at night by myself. Even between some of the tours, I'm out there by myself and some of the places that these stories take place. With that being said, I have had some strange things happen.
Such as?
Well, I lived in the park for about 6 years, and I had a regular knock on the wall. The house had doors on either ends that had been just walled in. And when I didn't know they were doors at one time. One of them is now like a bookcase. And every night when I'd get off work, I would settle in the house, and a lot of times I'd still be on call. So sometimes I'd just leave my uniform on until time to go to bed, and I'd hear this real sharp just knock right on the outside of the wall. I dismissed it because, a lot of times old houses will crack and pop and stuff, but it was very regular. And the first few times I heard it, I actually thought somebody was messing with me and was outside because it didn't sound like a house popping or crackling. It sounded like somebody coming up. But it was just one sharp knock, though, not two. Mm-hmm. And I actually went outside thinking, no, it's some park visitor just trying to mess with me. I'd go out there and there wasn't nobody. And I didn't think much about it, but it got to be very regular. So much so that I could be sitting there, and it was about 9 o'clock. And if I was in the living room at 9 o'clock, I'd hear that knock almost every, depending on, it didn't matter temperature either. If you think, well, if the house pops and cracks at a certain temperature, it was more of a timing thing than it was a temperature thing. And now I tell the seasonals, because a lot of times they live in that old house that I lived in, and they always like, oh, don't tell me that. Some of them have said they've heard that knock, but some of them have said it's been different times of the day. For them it was around lunchtime or in the morning, whereas mine was always in the evening. And I've definitely had some, I don't know, like when I go back to the group camp, I've had some eerie vibes, I guess, if you want to say that, but I don't think much about it really. It's not that I don't believe in ghosts. I feel like, I don't know, maybe if you let things like that bother you, you're more likely to see them. And so I'm a believer in Christ. And so if there are ghosts, I know I've got a protection that protects me. And so whether they exist or don't exist, I know I got somebody watching my back. And so, but the stories are interesting. And
do you have a favorite?
Do I have a favorite? I guess so. Yeah, I think the story of Fletcher and Rose is one of my favorites. And I'm fortunate enough that when we do the storytelling, a lot of times I was able to snatch that story up since it was my favorite. And because we tell a lot of times we reenact some of the stories as characters that would have told them. So we dress in period clothing and reenact some of these storytelling, or we tell the stories as if we're one of the characters. And so, yeah, I snatched that one up as fast as I could because that was probably one of my favorites. And it's a story about George Jones, not the possum, that is, but George Jones that lived on the backside of the park. He had several kids and had a wife named Chloe, and they were neighbors with Maston. And if you've never heard any of these stories, a lot of them revolved around Maston and his family.
Now, who is Maston?
Maston was a gentleman named Maston Hutchison, and he lived back on the backside of the park. And a lot of his family and kinfolk had succumbed to tuberculosis. The way the stories was told is that they had caught, the first person that brought tuberculosis in the area was this lady they called Aunt Mary. And I don't know whose aunt she was, but Aunt Mary brought tuberculosis back to Big Ridge from, she had been nursing Civil War soldiers back to health in Knoxville and had caught tuberculosis. And at that time, we didn't have an understanding of that it being a bacterial infection that we could actually take care of it. So people would slowly die of it. And that was happening up at Big Ridge. And a lot of Maston's family had slowly died from tuberculosis. And those were where a lot of the ghost stories originated or started kind of blossoming from. And then, so the story of Fletcher and Rose is sometime down the road, long after Maston and his family either had died or moved off, the house still sat empty because nobody wanted to live in it. And then George and his wife, the way the story's told, they decided they had had enough of all the rumblings, grumblings, and ghost-like things that it really drove them away. And they decided to move into what the town of Lewiston, which was just over a few ridges, which is now actually under the lake. That's why they call that Lewiston Sea area, Lewiston Sea. And so then he had a brother named Fletcher that wanted to go move up. He really wanted to, him and his new bride, Rose, wanted to get away. And they were going to have to live with her mama after they got married. And so George kind of made a deal with him, said, look, you know, our house is sitting up there, and we just moved out of it. It's in good shape. If you want it, you can have it. And he said, just try go stay in it one night, and if you like it, it's yours. And of course, George knew what he was asking of him, and Fletcher did too, because apparently, you know, being brothers with George, he had traveled up there and stayed nights sometimes with George and his wife, and he wasn't too keen on it, but Rose loved the idea of not having to live as newlyweds with her mom. And so they moved up there, and it didn't go. Their first night didn't go so well at all, and they chose not to live up there because of the things they experienced. And so, you know, there's a lot of details to the story that I won't go on into sharing, but you know, I guess what brings a lot of validity to the story is that you know, Rose never liked talking about it, and kind of wouldn't bring it up. Definitely wouldn't bring it up. And when other people would bring it up, she tried to not talk about it. And let's be honest, you know how country people are around here. You know, we a lot of times we know each other's business, and so they would ask Rose, how come y'all ain't living in Georgia's perfectly good place up there? And she refused to tell what happened. She would just say, the place didn't suit us. But they say up until she died, she really never liked talking about it. But now George was definitely willing to talk about his experiences and would tell a little bit about what his brother and Rose went through. And Fletcher apparently wouldn't even go up there and help George, his brother, farm the area anymore, because even after they moved to Lewiston, they would travel back up there and I guess still grow some corn and tobacco. But Fletcher wouldn't have no part in going back up there. And so...
When would the story have been set? Back in the 1800s?
It would have been 1800s, yes, sir. It would have been...
House long gone, of course.
Yeah, now the houses are long gone. There are some remnants of the foundation. Sometimes if you really know what you're looking for, especially people back then dug root cellars, and so you'll have these big depressions in the ground. And then sometimes you might find an old cistern well, maybe even a pile of rocks where maybe a chimney stood at one time, and now it's all crumbled down into a big pile of rocks. So yes, now the homes are long gone. And we get that question a lot of times. People say, if it's a ghost house trail, why ain't there no house out here? And so you don't have to explain to them, you know, this happened, you know, well, definitely after Civil War, but it was also before the park took over in 1936 of the land, before they created the lake. So it was during that time period that happened. But you know, there's a lot of history to the park. Even before the ghost stories, civilization started taking off. There was Native Americans that lived here. No one really knows how long, but probably thousands of years before European settlers came. And once European settlers came, it didn't take them long to just really populate the area. And it all started at Sharps Station, which is on the backside of the park. And so not only is Big Ridge just a beautiful place, but it's also very significant with Tennessee's state history. At the time when this station was set there, it was actually still part of North Carolina territory. And this was in 1792, 93. So you're looking at just a few years before this area became what is known as now Tennessee. And so those people, it didn't take them long before they kind of spread out and was living all over what's now known as Union County. And the population was actually quite large in this area because of the Clinch River being great farmland. It was also a means of transportation through the area, moving west because the river is a easier means of transportation. Taking a boat down the Clinch, people that came from east out of Virginia, eventually worked their way west, and some just decided to stay here and settle and farm and live. And so that's where there's a very significant history behind that station, Sharp Station.
Definitely worth going to see and hear more about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so if you ever got time and you want to come and you got any questions about the fort and you want to come and talk to me about it,
and I would predict, Union County has these wonderful treasures, but sometimes the people that know the least about them are the ones that live right next to them because we just don't go there.
That's true. Like I was saying earlier, a lot of people know the park like the back of their hand. And they might know the land very well because they've been out there, but a lot of times they may not know the history. I've had a lot of people that have, when I share the history with them, they said, I didn't know that, And so you're right. A lot of times people may not know, and maybe they know a little bit, but they just really didn't know the details. And we don't know a lot of details, but we can paint enough pictures of where people really get an understanding of what it might have been like for those people that lived here 250 years ago.
I'm finally about out of questions.
Okay.
Although I could come up with more if we had more time.
Well, thanks for having me.
Have enjoyed immensely.
I've enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for letting me share about the park.
And we may have you back sometime in the future to share a little bit more.
I'd be glad to.
And we thank you for joining us for this episode. And until the next, take care and be safe.